Evolutionary.org Hardcore 2.0, episode 67, coming your way. Today we're going to talk about the benefits of Masteron and Proviron for free testosterone with EuroPharma. And we're also going to go over other steroids that are beneficial and why they're beneficial when it comes to boosting your free testosterone. So this is going to be part of the three-part series that we did, 65, 66, and now 67. So if you haven't listened to the 65 and 66, I recommend you also go back. But in this one, we're going to kind of review everything. This is a really, really good one. And this is going to help you save you money. And it's also going to help you better put together stacks because you're going to get way more out of your stacks. So we're going to talk about free testosterone. We're going to go over a review of that. We're going to talk about more about Masteron and Proviron. We're also going to talk about sex hormone binding globulin. Mobster is going to touch on a couple studies, give you some examples with, CAR. He had a CAR example that he came up with, which was really good. He's going to go over that. We're going to go over the other DHT EuroPharmacies steroids that would really good to stack. And we're going to talk about how to stack them. And we're going to talk about side effects to look for. If you do mess around with these DHT derivatives, what side effects you could be opening yourself for. And we're going to talk about why we love EuroPharmacies and all this. So it's going to be a really good show. So let's hit it, Mobster. So let's start with the difference between free and bound testosterone. So free and total testosterone, unbound versus bound testosterone. And look, at the end of the day, what matters is the free testosterone. You can get your blood work done and you could come out and have 700 nanograms per deciliter, total testosterone. But if your free testosterone levels are under the range, you're not getting the full benefits. So at the end of the day, that's what matters. So we want to optimize the cycle. The whole point of stacking steroids isn't just blindfolding you and having you throw darts at a board and hoping that you hit the bar, because that's what a lot of people do. And a lot of people end up hurting themselves because they're using too many steroids that they don't need. And they end up not even needing that, because it's like, if you look at their cycle, you're like, wow, if you could have just put this steroid here and that steroid there, instead of using 10 different steroids, you could have used 3 or 4 steroids or even 2 steroids, and you would have had just as good of results with way less side effects. So that's
Steve,
the way. Good.
Something that happens a lot, right? And we talked about this in one of the other shows in part 1 and part 2, is that we see some fantastic numbers in the blood test, but it's the total testosterone number. And as I said on one of the other shows, that's a great indicator that the gear you got's legit. But it's no good having 3,000 nanograms a deciliter and not being getting the most out of your cycle versus, as Steve says, 1,000 nanograms or 1,200 or 1,500 and having the best results possible. And it's that little difference between the focus on the top number and specifically the difference between total testosterone and free testosterone, which is really the most important thing. It's sometimes, and we talked about the reasons why and how you can manipulate those reasons in terms of diet and training, but sometimes we get hung up on the big number when we should really be hung up on the free testosterone. And again, the difference between one person and the next getting better results because they focused on the free testosterone and they did what they could to make sure that that number was a bigger number than it would otherwise be. And that is really what the takeaway should be more than anything else. Now, of course, what we're going to talk about today, less the outside variables, training, diet, and so on that we talked about before, and more specifically, how to boost that bottom number with Masteron and Proviron, and of course talk about other DHT derivatives, which we're going to discuss, and how those things and manipulating that particular variable is going to give you better results than someone with an absolutely amazing total testosterone number, and for whatever reason in their mind, not seeing the results that they ought to. And that's really the takeaway, Steve.
All right, so let's talk about EuroPharmacies, Masteron, and Proviron. And look, at the end of the day, it's very important to remember with these, they are DHT derivatives, and I'm going to get into in a little bit in the show why DHT derivatives do such a good job of binding to SHBG and the way they compete for receptors and all that stuff. And look, at the end of the day, these two are the premier. In the last episode, Mobster actually read a study he got off of Wikipedia, which got it off a study. And basically he read these are the top two, and that makes sense because these are as
Yes.
pure DHT derivatives as you're going to find.
Number one, Steve. Number one was the Proviron. With they had a baseline reference of 100%, which was a DHT, and then Proviron was 440% better at freeing up free testosterone
Yeah.
than the baseline. They didn't have a good list of what we would like to call PEDs. They had different references in there. A couple of those were pro hormones, I believe, or older versions of steroids. But nevertheless, the baseline versus Proviron is fantastic. And again, it's a close first and second relationship here. I've seen 5 to 10% from Masteron. Again, I think that also comes down to the condition of the person in question, and studies will have different people in different conditions. But the bottom line here is whether it's 4.4 times or 5 times for either of these two steroids, you have to pay attention to what's being said here, because that's just a way of boosting your results. And both of them are fantastic. That even to a lesser degree, the other DHT derivatives that we're talking about are equally good, but maybe not on paper 4.4%, 5%, or 5 times, sorry, 4.4 times and 5 times as good as the baseline. But nevertheless, it's the difference between having a good cycle and an amazing cycle.
All right, so look, which one would you choose? And Masteron, of course, is the injectable. So let's say you hate needles, you despise needles, but you deal with them. You use steroids, and you have to deal with them. I don't like needles. I'm not a fan of them. Some people don't mind them. I'm not a fan of them. So
No,
for me, look, I'd go with Proviron, in that
me
situation.
too.
But if you don't mind the needles, you'd rather just pin once a week and use the long ester Masteron, or you don't mind pinning the propionate Masteron every other day, every third day, whatever, or every day
Yeah,
even, then you go with the Masteron. But look, at the end of the day, economically, buying from EuroPharmacies, both of them are affordable. They're not going to break the bank. It's not like
yeah,
they're extremely expensive, and so they're affordable. But like with the Proviron, you could run, I think a good dose of Proviron you could run is 25 milligrams a day. And the
yeah,
nice thing about it, since it's not liver toxic, it's not 17 alpha alkylated, you could run it throughout your cycle. Masteron, you could run it throughout your cycle as well, but you'd be pinning. You'd having to, good idea would be diluting it with another steroid. And so for me personally, I like Proviron. Masteron gives me more side effects, and we're going to get into side effects later on the show. It gives me a little bit too many side effects of unwanted side effects that I don't like. Maybe a little too many pumps, maybe a little too much hardening, maybe a little too much hair, a little more rough on the hair. Proviron, I didn't notice really any side effects. Really is a really good drug. So for me, I go to EuroPharmacies Proviron. But
yeah,
if you notice with professional bodybuilders, they like to mix their gear in the syringe. They'd rather take it like that. They take too many pills as it is. So they like to go more injectables. It's a lot easier just to get 500 milligrams of Masteron into a syringe and mix it with another steroid and go ahead and pin a big amount at a time than it is to take a bunch of Proviron, day in and day out, because they're already taking so much stuff as it is. So really it just depends on your personal preference, but I would give the edge definitely from me to Proviron just because of the side effect. How about you, Mobster? Which one would you prefer?
yeah. I would go with Proviron as well. But one of the comments I saw associated with the information that we're referencing today was something to the effect of that certain members on another forum where some of the information came from was like, oh, it's going to be that much more expensive. But there's actually an argument against that. Right. So first off, it's not really that expensive at all. But they were talking about in addition to the money that they'd already spent on the cycle. So I've got to spend some more money to go my. Actually, no, because if we're talking about the idea, and one of the analogies was like adding a turbo to your car, you're actually doing something that's not, you're not changing the whole fucking engine here. You're just adding something to it, and you're actually making it more powerful. Everything else remains exactly the same. So arguably, you could use less of the other PEDs, less testosterone, whatever else that your cycle was made of, and then add the Proviron in to boost the smaller amount that you're using above and beyond the results that you would have got using a larger amount of testosterone to try and get the same results. So arguably, it's actually more economical. So, I mean, I would go 100%, Steve. I've seen numbers as high as 75 milligrams a day of Proviron. I think if I was doing that on top of everything else, I might mix it into the syringe with other things that I was doing. I would look at the half-life of the Masteron or Proviron as an injectable and make it on that basis. But I would probably go single 25 milligram pill for every day of the cycle. No, nothing complicated. It's only one word pill for me. Most of the pills I use now are relatively small. It's no big deal. One in the morning, job done, Steve. So keep it real simple. And I mean, I'm actually looking forward to doing something like this later in the year just to see the results that I get. Steve and I are both not big fans of syringes, and neither one of us are large volume milligram PED users. So the idea that we could run the kind of cycles that we already run and get a boost from it for arguably on a daily basis, Steve, what are we looking at here? $1, not even, maybe not even $1 per day. And then when you see people say, "Oh, it's another expense," come on, motherfucker, just spend $8 on a coffee. You literally take your $1,000 cycle and add the equivalent of $1 per day, so $30 a month, and boost your results. That actually sounds like a fucking amazing deal to me, Steve, especially with the kind of prices that we pay. So yeah, I mean, for me, this is EuroPharmacies prices. I know what they're like. This will be a great thing, and to me, I'm looking forward to giving it a go, Steve. As I said in the last show, it's ironic when we do these shows and we put out this information that you and the amount of cycles that I've done over the years. Why the fuck didn't I do this before? So yeah, I'm looking forward to it, Steve. See what the results are. Absolutely, man. Yeah, but $1 a day, because that's what we're looking at, guys. 25 milligrams, easy peasy all day long. If you're doing multiple pins, if you're okay with mixing, which we are, 2 different steroids in the same syringe, and you're using a longer acting ester, say a couple of times a week, or a shorter acting, like Steve said, especially if you're already doing other products, other PEDs in your cycle, which have a shorter acting, other propionates, etc. It's just a very small addition to what you're already doing, so there's no big deal again. I'm looking forward to seeing listeners' results, Steve, and myself and yourself as well. Back to you.
So when it, there's a reason why pro bodybuilders usually will have both Masteron and Proviron. There's a reason. So that's one of the big things that we see with these big cycles. So definitely we know it works, and coaches know it works, and bodybuilders know it works, and that's why they include it. So
it's dead simple, Steve. Sorry, it's real simple. Basically, one would be specifically, this is what I think. And again, you could argue with the gurus in question, but I suspect it's a combination of 2 things. We know that Proviron in and of itself is going to boost the cycle, as we've discussed, and it's going to produce specifically the more free testosterone that we want. We know that Masteron does that, and Masteron also, of course, has the hardening effects. And if you're a competing bodybuilder, if you're a professional competing bodybuilder, naturally, then you are going to need both the boosting properties of them both, but specifically Proviron, and the hardening properties, as well as the boosting properties specifically of Masteron. So again, maybe not right at the beginning. Masteron might come in later on as the body fat comes down. Competition or competitive cycles tend to be structured over a certain period of time, so it's not all the same all the way through the cycle, and you tend to look at more hardening, drying, vascularity effects, etc. towards the end as you get closer to stage condition. And so obviously they might have different amounts at different points in the thing. And again, if you are working with a coach that's prepping you for a competition, they should be manipulating their variables as your body changes. They should be looking to see what they need to manipulate those variables as you get into condition. You can't just say week 1 is this, week 16 is that, and then have the person turn up fat and out of shape because you hadn't looked at them, you hadn't seen them doing cardio. So yeah, but are these 2 common in cycles? Absolutely, Steve. Absolutely.
All right, so let's go on to the next topic here. And Mobster, this is something that you came up here when it comes to putting together the car example and talking about. Go ahead.
Yeah. So there's some argument, Steve, and we've seen this for years with the whole receptor clearance and all this kind of stuff, and it gets really convoluted and complicated for a great many people, and it's kind of hard sometimes to understand. And I don't even think the receptor science is really as understood as we'd like it to be, in the same way, ironically, that we don't completely understand the complete process of what actually builds muscle as a result of exercise. We have some ideas, but they change all the time, and there's a lot of back and forth, and I've seen multiple arguments. So you want sometimes with these kind of podcasts to have simple analogies that work for most people. I'm going to read specifically from this, right? So I'm quoting from a document when I read this out. How does all this work? SHBG, which increases after the age of 27, inhibits testosterone. Testosterone circulates in the bloodstream, bound mostly to SHBG. Only 1 to 2% is, inverted commas, free, and thus biologically available. And again, Steve and I talked about nature and how it works. You can't constantly grow and so on and so forth, and you don't need to be growing all the time. But of course, we lift, we train, we want more muscle. We want to be gaining all the time. What Masteron does is it uncouples the bound testosterone from SHBG, making it free and therefore biologically active. I would also add unavailable, of course, Steve. So the analogy was, think of a parking lot. The spaces are your testosterone receptors. The lot is full up. Every single space in the car park is full. Masteron is like a tow truck that comes in and tows cars away, freeing them up for more results from your testosterone. 400 milligrams, for example, and obviously these would be variable figures, have the effects of 600 milligrams, because of course it's made available more space for the free testosterone to help you build, manufacture, call it what you like, real muscle, more muscle. Now, of course, guys, you must be training your asses off and everything else must be on point. But you're making this situation happen. You're making it occur with Masteron or, of course, Proviron to free up that space to allow more muscle to be built if the stimulus is there. So we can't just go, I'll train like a pussy and take these 2 drugs and get bigger. You might, maybe like, I don't know, half a pound, Steve. But if you're training your asses off, you're creating a stimulus for muscular growth, you're feeding it with protein and other nutrients, then this will aid that journey. And in fact, arguably, as it says here with the analogy, free up space, free up more receptors for muscle building purposes, allowing for more growth. And that's the bottom line. If I was running a car park, Steve, it's making me more money. For the listeners, it's making you more muscle. It's as simple as that, Steve. So yeah, I mean, that's one analogy. So, I mean, on the next popular part of the topic, right, and I'm going to put this into 2 places while I talk to the listeners. So one specifically was that Proviron was used in 2 studies, and I'm going to talk about the first one here, Steve. And let me talk about the other things that were studied at the same time. So it was to do with people, they wanted the measures and results, the side effects, did they have an effect on the blood measures and so on and so forth. And they measured a testosterone implant, restanodol, Proviron, which was El Numero Uno, we can talk about that in a second, Testogel, Libido, SCR, Andromen, SCR, and so on and so forth. Basically, very simply, arguably talking about the effects of these various steroids or testosterone-like products that were being given to users, and then they wanted to know the health markers and the ranges of the health markers of all of those items. Now, specifically, Proviron is underlined, and the numbers are there, and you look at the various variables, etc., etc. Steve, so there's a bunch here. Don't even begin to ask me what they all are, but I'll bring you the 2 that are super important, which is LH and then FSH, right? And the markers, for example, for the testosterone implant were 2.94. The one for, and I'm just looking at another one, is the Testogel was 3.26, and so on and so forth. And if you look at all the markers up and down, most of those markers are slightly higher. And the actual one that's almost the lowest is 2.94 compared to the testosterone implant with 2.99 for the Proviron versus 2.94 for the testosterone implant. So those were the 2 lowest, and the others were all higher. And you look at the numbers and you say, which is the better, which is the worse? It goes on. FSH, Steve. And of course, it's talking about the variables here. And the number at the end of each of these figures is 0.33 for the LH and 1.36 for the FSH. And then you look at all of the other numbers and you say, which is the best? And Proviron was the best. As an example, on the FSH, loss of minus 4.79. Restanodol, 2.49. I'll go down to Testogel, 4.42. Libido, 4.42. SCR 4.69. The lowest, Steve, was 1.36 for Proviron. That is, there is nothing else on that list, on the FSH, loss of, etc., sig figures, and so on and so forth, to give you a number. That is absolutely lowest. In other words, looking at this, the health markers for Proviron compared to things like testosterone, libido, etc., was the best. So what are we looking at here, Steve? We're looking at almost no side effects of the measures that they were looking for specifically. I read out the actual thing that the whole list, and I'll read out the title. It's a bit of a mouthful, listeners, but it makes sense when I say it in this particular way. Symptom score and endocrine changes between the initial visit and after 1 year. So make a note of that. That's 12 months on these treatments, with 7 different testosterone preparations: ACL total symptom score, TT total testosterone, SHBG sex hormone blinding globulin, E2 estrogen, of course, or estradiol, and then luteinizing hormone, Steve, and then FH follicle stimulating hormone. And so again, so the users were on the product for 12 months. That's every single one. They were looking at the total markers, total testosterone, SHBG issues, E2 issues, and so on and so forth. And every single one, the complete and utter, all the way down, with maybe 1 or 2 exceptions, Proviron outscored or was better than every single other one. Now, as you know, Steve, Testogel in testosterone implants for TRT purposes were, at that time, especially when the study was done, incredibly common, over and above, say, the injection and or pill route that we could talk about now, and are still relatively common in terms of use. So you have to ask, and in fact, the person that put this information together and referenced the study says, why is Proviron so underrated? Because of, look at the numbers that we were looking at here. And again, if we just use a total testosterone, Steve, I believe one is 4 TT pre-E, so pre, and total testosterone 1 year. Before, the total testosterone before was 16.6. This is for Proviron again. Total testosterone after 1 year was 14.6. Let me see if they have. Just trying to look here, Steve. Okay, so.
Yeah, and while you're doing that, listen, Proviron,
yeah,
look, the reason they say, you know, why is it underrated is because, look, if you run it by itself, it's not going to do anything for you. It's not androgenic. It's not very anabolic, you know, so just running Proviron by itself, 50 milligrams for 4 weeks, you're not going to notice much, you know, maybe you'll notice a little hardening effects, but it's not going to do anything for you. But if you take 4 weeks of Anadrol or 4 weeks of Halo or 4 weeks of Superdrol or 4 weeks of D-Bol or even 4 weeks of Anavar or T-Bol, you'll notice a lot more stuff. So that's why they say it's underrated. So it's essential with Proviron to make sure it's part of a stack. And that pretty much sums up why. But some bodybuilders are like, Proviron, it's garbage. I'm not going to waste my time with it. And they're not wrong. You know, if you're going to spend money on Anavar versus Proviron, and if you're just running some testosterone with it, then it may not be a bad idea to actually choose the Anavar, you know? So, yeah. Go ahead, Monster.
Yeah, I mean, what they've done here, and this is kind of useful in this particular way, right? So they took all the earlier measures that I've mentioned already, and they gave everything a score. And everything bar 1, which was restanadol, was minus. Sorry, all the others are plus, right? So the Proviron and restanadol are minus. The Proviron was minus 19 and restanadol was minus 8. Everything else is higher. In other words, all of the markers that they were looking for went up on everything except for those 2 particular products. So again, that means, for example, again, SHBG score, Stevia Proviron was to begin with 35.8 and at the end 28.4. But the total score, as I said just now, is lowered all the way across. All the measures in the blood that you would worry about, SHBG is an obvious one, ACL is an obvious one, and so on and so forth, went down on just those 2 products. The restanadol, Steve, I'm going to guess is even less anabolic than Proviron. So for our purposes, we ignore it, but we compare it to everything else, like I said already, Testosterone, libido, and so on and so forth. And you go, how come all of the others? I mean, one of the worst ones here, Steve, which they call it SCR, I'm not sure what it is for plus 47. Andro MN is plus 44. I mean, basically, all the fucking horrible measures that we don't want by The difference between the two is 63 points on their scale, minus 19 for Proviron and plus 44 for that particular product. I mean, for fuck's sake, Steve, you're going to put people on CRT, you're going to try these different measures, and every single one, bar one other product, are worse for blood markers, probably even less poor for anabolic purposes, and including the only other one which beat it. And all of the health markers, the FSH, the LH, etc., 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 are all worse right across the board. We need to show the listeners, I think, a copy of this panel and let them analyze it for themselves, just to see the numbers. And it's done in, there's underlined in red, etc., etc. You can read the numbers for yourself, and you can judge for yourself the kind of information. I mean, look, I've said this before. When it comes to studies, okay, you need to look at the people in the study, and in this particular one, it's people with testosterone issues. So if you don't have testosterone issues, you should have better results. If you have a healthy lifestyle, you should have better results. If your diet's on point, you should have better results. These are people that have to go on CRT. A lot of other studies tend to use people that are either untrained or already out of shape, who will almost automatically respond better than someone that's been training for a while, because we all know how great the results right at the beginning. It is important when we talk about TRT or PED use and forms of testosterone and the cycles that we discuss. Steve and I hammer the point of being as healthy as you possibly can, both because you started to train and put your nutrition on point, and also, of course, because you would like to maintain some great markers for health post-cycle, and not damage your health, etc., in the long run with crazy cycles or extreme PED use. So it's important to us to see these kind of numbers and see these kind of figures. And again, when it comes to studies, it can be difficult sometimes with a takeaway, because the purpose of the study might not have been for someone at training and wants to get a better anabolic result as a result of their cycle, whereas, of course, we do. That's the reason you're listening to this show. And it can be difficult to understand, even for people like me and Steve, when we're looking at these things, because they'll do shorthand for certain particular things, Steve, or I might not understand one of the markers that they're using. But when we, for example, we look at the overall scoring that they've given, they're obviously going to look for things like estrogen. They're obviously going to look for things that we would call markers for liver and kidney function, and so on and so forth, over the length of the cycle. But the bottom line is, for this purposes, and I would argue with anybody against that the use of Proviron in this example is healthier than the other options. So the question again is, why don't they use Proviron, for example, for more TRT purposes? We know, and this is probably the only argument, Steve, when it comes to Proviron, never mind Masteron. Masteron we know is a hard one. Proviron on its own is arguably not that anabolic. But we're using it. I think one of the other analogies I saw, Steve, was as an additive to the fuel. When you put some of that red stuff into your car, you add it to the petrol, and it basically makes your engine work better. It's like using a high quality oil versus a cheap one in the oil part of your car to improve performance. For us, our bottom line is to improve results. Run on its own, next to nothing. The only other analogy, and I want to expand on something we did in another show, was the idea of running TRT and boosting your TRT results. I think that's a little bit vague, because TRT is typically for health reasons, and really in and of itself at normal TRT levels, you won't get much muscular growth. You still need to train your ass off. You still have to have your nutrition on point. And one of our forum members was big on the idea that this may be the way to go, to get anabolic response to look like a muscular bodybuilder using TRT. And I said, really, we don't understand what else is going on, because he was very vague with information. And if it worked specifically in the way that he was describing, then we'd all be on 300 milligrams a week, and we wouldn't need to be doing 600, 700, 800 milligrams. He might have seen some boost. So the idea had some water in his case, but not specifically for what he was actually looking for. He wasn't going to turn into Mr. Olympia on 300 milligrams. It had been done already. Someone would have already done it. But the idea that you can get better or more from, even in his example, 300 milligrams, yes, sure. Certainly better than, for example, 300 milligrams on its own. But realistically, do we see people using Proviron and running 300 milligrams a week, Steve? No, we do not. So that's one thing. The other thing, and I'm just going to touch on this briefly, Steve, in terms of cycles or whatever else, is this. There was another study done where they were talking about the idea of, I think it was an antidepressant, a placebo, and Proviron. And so this was another thing we're saying, why the hell isn't Proviron used more? So it didn't outperform, but it didn't underperform the antidepressant. Although arguably, we know this is the case with antidepressants, sometimes a placebo can be just as effective for antidepressive purposes. But first off, you don't have the antidepressive side effects, which arguably, Steve, ironically include more suicide and more depression for a small percentage of users. So you're not getting that with Proviron. And again, the end result of the study was, ironically, as I said, it didn't outperform or underperform the antidepressant, but it did have better health markers. In other words, the use of antidepressant pills, tablets, medication, or whatever else causes issues. Same as, for example, using ibuprofen as an anti-inflammatory. Ironically, as we know, it can actually cause inflammatory effects and cause, especially at high dosages, issues with the gut lining. So you end up irritating the stomach by using an anti-inflammatory to reduce inflammation on, for example, your elbow. In this example, the side effects of the antidepressant were worse than the Proviron. The blood markers were worse. The issues for inflammation or whatever were worse. And of course, it didn't have the side effects. It actually treated, and it was another one, Steve, OCD and anxiety. So some of the measures for that. So again, the person that put the article information together, we know who he is, and we're interviewing him very soon. Couldn't believe, again, that Proviron wasn't being used as an antidepressant. And I think the specific example he gave there, and Steve and I have discussed this in other shows, was Dynabol. And we've talked about the feel-good effects of using Dynabol. Why does it make you feel good? And so the argument was, he said, well, compare that to specifically Proviron being used to compare to an antidepressant in treating depression, anxiety, OCD, and so on and so forth with disorders. And some of these was 12-month studies, Steve. I believe in one example was 300 plus patients with a total time for treatment in excess of 400 years, so roughly 18 months per person. And again, these were the people that were being used in the study. I believe it was for a short period of time, about 4 weeks. And that may well be because they wanted to make sure that they were going to have no issues, for example, with people that would be depressed. If the treatment didn't work, they would be worse. They might need to go back on the original medication. And again, obviously, the health markers. So it was only done for a 4-week period of time just to see if measures in the blood were better or worse. It was better with Proviron compared to the antidepressant medication that they were actually on. So there's just some examples right there, Steve. But I mean, bottom line for us, again, is you're arguably looking at something that's not going to cause, as Steve said earlier on, too many side effects. In fact, next to none in and of itself. The cycle itself might cause some, and we'll talk about those, of course. Masteron arguably has probably got more, which is what Steve and I are looking at Proviron. And again, like I want to make sure this point is clear again. You will get more from your cycle, but you need to make sure that you are specifically training to cause the stimulus to happen. And of course, keeping your diet. You will get better results, as we said on previous shows. If you are healthy, you will get better results if you're training your asses off. You get better results if your nutrition's on point. But there's an argument to be made here, Steve, especially when you look at some of these other studies. Although they don't have the numbers, I think there was an indication to suggest that even, and we've seen this in a couple of studies before, not on this particular subject, that even untrained and non-training individuals have seen an anabolic response using steroids, typically between 1 and 3 pounds. Again, this is the younger person who's never trained before and so on and so forth. And this is without training, but with training, with good nutrition, with everything else on point, with a sensible dose cycle. I can't wait to see the fucking results for myself, just on that analogy alone, Steve. Let's talk about other things, like you said, other DHGs and the side effects, etc.
Yeah, so look, when it comes to steroids, I do a great job of buying an SHBG. Look no further than the DHT family of steroids. Well, why is that? And look, I put together a nice little scale that shows the different binding affinity of various sex steroids for sex hormone binding globulin, SHBG. So we start with with DHT, then is testosterone, then is androstenediol, then is estradiol, then is estrone. So that's basically the step ladder. So at the very top, the king at the very top is the DHT. So DHT is going to bind SHBG with about 5 times the affinity of testosterone and 20 times the affinity of estradiol. So yes, you see why when you're running a cycle, by adding these DHTs to your cycle, you're going to get more of an effect than just running testosterone. Now, does testosterone do it? Yes, but it does
Yes.
it way less, where you're
Yes.
not going to get the
Yes.
benefits. So, and at the end of the day, we're talking 20 times more the affinity of estradiol, 20 times more. That's a big,
That's a
big amount.
fantastic thing. That's
Yeah.
crazy.
So
Imagine
that's
the
why you
listeners
see,
getting that kind of return on anything else that you did. 20 times the results. You tried
yeah,
studied harder at school. 20
this is
times the results
why,
if you invested well.
let me, I'll let you in, Monster, but let me just say this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You carry
People
on, man.
who, when people are running too much testosterone for TRT and they're not running an AI, right? So they get
Yeah.
their estrogen high, they get their testosterone high.
Mm.
That's why you see those people have issues and they're not able to get the most out of their TRT versus someone who runs a correct amount of TRT and maybe
Yeah.
adds a little Proviron to it, just a little bit of Proviron to it to kind of give that binding. And then bam, I feel so much better. I have my sex hormone binding globulin is nice and low, so I'm able
Yeah.
to better tap into that. So that's kind of the difference. And we see that with steroid cycles, not just with TRT. I'm just giving you an example. How about
Yeah. Yeah.
steroid
Yeah.
cycles where guys are running 500 milligrams of testosterone or 1,000 milligrams of testosterone? They're not using an AI. Their estrogen is sky high. What do you think's happening there? What do you think's happening to the DHT? What do you think? Not the DHT, but what do you think's happening to sex hormone binding globulin? Well, it's going up. It's going up. So you're unable to really tap into it. So that might explain why sometimes people that run steroid cycles and they'll repeatedly run testosterone, and then they'll notice over time, I'm not getting the results that I was hoping for. My results basically are getting diluted. Well, it's because you're not getting your SHBG under control. In fact, it's getting out of control because your estrogen is going sky high. Go ahead, Monster.
Yeah, I mean, one of the examples, just to use the theoretical stuff that we sometimes see, right? I mean, and I'm sure Steve and I have been exactly the same as this back in the day. As I've already said, we're learning every time we do one of these kind of shows. This is all new stuff for me. So some gurus have had a handle on this for a long time, Steve. It's new for us, and only because we've looked deeper into it than we did before. So let me give you an example. Okay, so every so often, someone is starting to get a handle on the science and the theoretical stuff when it comes to PED use will say, it, they will ask the question, Steve, I would like to get my estrogen as low as possible. And the phrase that comes out quite often is crushing my estrogen because surely the results will be better. And you go, no, you mustn't do that. I understand where you're coming from. If estrogen is inhibiting your results because it's too high, then it kind of almost makes some sort of perverse sense to go, well, why do we need estrogen? We go, actually, you do, motherfucker. So when we talk about using AIs or whatever else, we say, no, listen, right? You want lower estrogen, especially if it's high. You want it within range or towards the lower end, but you don't want to, as we say, crush it. So we kind of get into that back and forth with people, and you have to explain, listen, right? There are reasons why your body does what it does. There are reasons why, and Steve and I have discussed this multiple times, you cannot grow constantly. You can't become 400 or 500 pounds. You can't grow or add a pound a week. That'll be 52 pounds in the year and so on and so forth. So the body will respond in a certain way. Then you've got issues with PED use again, not to sound too negative, Steve, or preachy, but we will sometimes see people that won't come off gear. And they're not really doing CRT, they're barely cruising. Some of them are on stuff that is essentially a cycle all year round. And we talk about issues with, your HPTA and all this kind of stuff, Steve. But at the same time, it's some of that is that they don't want to come off because they're fearful of losing gains. And yet in reality, you will actually increase your response and increase your gains if you have sufficient time off between cycles. Now, arguably, Steve, we could probably run Proviron year round and get the benefits, and especially if you're on TRT or arguably cruising at a sensible dose. Neither of Steve and I are big fans of cruising. There may well be in the not too distant future for myself and a few more years after that for Steve, TRT for obvious reasons, simply just getting older and feeling better and maintaining a certain level of muscle, but not at this minute. We're not looking at sports TRT. We'd probably be 100 or 200 milligrams a week and so on. So the whole back and forth, learning as we go along makes sense. And we can understand sometimes why these questions get asked. But I mean, here, Steve, I just like the stuff that we sort of figures that we're throwing out there. The idea that we could arguably use something that's 20 times as effective as a baseline DHT makes a lot of sense. The idea that you can run sensible cycles and get great results makes a lot of sense. The idea that you keep your estrogen in range or slightly lower, but don't crush it, makes sense, and so on and so forth, especially as we learn the effects these hormones have on our body. And of course, understanding that we aren't a ticking clock when it comes to hormones. Steve and I have talked about this. Your testosterone levels naturally vary through the fucking day, never mind the week and the month. And that's just as men. It varies through the day for women, but especially changes over the point of the menstrual cycle. And so the more we understand about how the body works, the more we understand how drugs and PEDs specifically have on our body, the better that we understand time off it works for you, a proper PCT works for you, not crushing certain hormones, not needing to run grams and grams, and still getting great results has to be, say, arguably a fucking positive. And I can't see anybody saying it isn't. I mean, you're going to have to be completely obsessed and out there doing 5, 6, 10 grams a week or whatever else, and just crazy obsessed with the ideas more testosterone equals more muscle. When arguably, if you work within what the body wants to do and you are aware of the parameters and you're aware of the effects, then look at it this way, Steve. This is a thing that I was just thinking as I was saying these words. Imagine the typical gains that an average person, an average Joe with normal testosterone levels who decides to use PDs, let's say that on average, for the first 5 years, they gain 6 pounds a year. And we've given you something that might help you gain another 2 pounds a year. Well, that's first off, that's another 10 pounds of muscle over the 5 years. You've gone from 6 pounds of muscle, maybe, and it's probably a little bit less than that on average, to 8 pounds of muscle. 5 years, there's 40 pounds of muscle, as opposed to 30 pounds of muscle. Well, 10 pounds is fucking 10 pounds. I'll take 10 pounds of muscle right fucking now. So the idea that we use some of these bits of information to gain that extra percentage and still have healthy blood markers and have a better understanding of what's going on has to be, as I said just now, an absolute fucking bonus, Steve. Talk about, for example, if you want to, Steve, the other options and the reasons why they're good.
Yeah, let's go over what EuroPharmacies has to offer. And the first couple, Primobolan. And they have a couple Primobolan options. They have a Primobolan acetate, which is 50 milligrams a milliliter. They have a Primobolan enanthate, 100 milligrams a milliliter. And these, you'd want to run the Primobolan anywhere from 300 to 500 milligrams a week total. It's a really, really good one. Again, since it's a DHT, it works a lot better stacked. Using it by itself, you could do it. But even in the 70s, Arnold loved Primobolan. The other guys loved Primobolan in the golden age. What they would do, they throw in some D-bol with it. With it. The D-bol is a good it's a good testosterone derivative. Gives you a little kick to the cycle, a little energetic kick, and then the Primo kind of makes it work. It makes it work better. So that's a good option. Another one, if you want to jump in on any of these, Mobster, and touch on
I was going to say, Steve, in regards to the Primo, we've just recorded, I think, like early last week, a Primo podcast. So definitely check that one out in terms of information. Primo, for me, again, is something that we've discussed in other shows. And I've seen this analogy used elsewhere where they said in a modern cycle, Primo helps the rest of the stack shine. I think arguably we're talking about Proviron in the same way now. Perhaps we should have been doing that before. But Primo, certainly back in the day, because they didn't have a lot of testosterone options, was a big one. And one of the reasons, and I've talked about this on the Primo show, Steve, that the people like Arnold, etc., would do this, is especially when they were cutting down for a competition, it was holding on to the muscle that they spent the winter, the off-season, gained and spent the cycle, the debo, etc., was more about, again, bulking up, adding muscle, and so on and so forth. And then when you're dieting down, you don't want to lose your hard-earned muscle. So arguably here, Steve, I could see Primo in this example being a great cutter part of a great cutter stack in the shape of the summertime. And again, with the addition of Masteron and or especially cutter cycle as you harden up and get leaner, the addition of Masteron or Proviron as a means of boosting the cycle seems to work for me. So I'd actually probably run here in this example, Steve, something like that, Primo and perhaps Masteron together, especially the latter part of the cycle, with the idea that you're cutting and hardening those muscles. Again, that sounds like a great one for me. Another example here is injectable Winstrol. We know that Winstrol is a great example for hardening and cutting again, Steve. 50 milligrams a milliliter from EuroPharmacies. And of course, they do an oral option in they call it Stenozolex Winstrol, and they do a 10 milligram and a 25 milligram option there. Easy peasy, Steve, for me would be 2 25 milligram tablets a day, in addition to whatever else is running with a cycle. And now, of course, as we're discussing it, you and I talked about this already. Our option would probably be a simple 25 milligrams a day of Proviron to boost that particular stack. And again, you've got the option of running something else there to help with the cutting. So it wouldn't be Deca or Sastanon, because of course I love those as bulkers. It might be, for example, the injectable Winstrol, perhaps Anavar, and again the Proviron, something like that. And again, I'm looking here, Steve, milligrams per week, etc., etc. If it was injectable Winstrol, somewhere between 250 and 300 milligrams a week, 350 maybe, in combination with something else. And even with the Proviron option, I'd want to keep all of that under a gram. So somewhere between 800 and 900 milligrams total per week. But again, the difference between not having a Proviron or a Masteron option and having a Proviron and Masteron option in this example, and because of the information we give you in this show, would be as I said already, Steve, you'd be leaving something on the table. You would be losing a little bit of muscle you wouldn't have otherwise lost because you've boosted it. You'd be that little bit leaner than you would otherwise be. All other parameters being dead on the same. Talk about another couple of options here, Steve.
Yeah, so how about Taroxol? EuroPharmacies Turinabol, 10 milligrams and 25 milligrams. So it's a good option. T-Bold, very, very mild steroid. Again, using it by itself, it's just not going to do much. But when you use it in a stack, it can be terrific. Same thing with the next one, Anavar. Oxandrolix, Anavar, 10 milligrams and 25 milligrams. Now, this one, more likely you can use it on its own. You're going to get definitely more benefits than the T-Bold, but when used stacked, example, Tren. I stacked both of these with Tren before, and I was able to hit all-time personal records on that stack.
Yep.
But if I'd used the T-Bold by itself or the Anavar by itself, I wouldn't have had PRs. And if I would have used the Tren by itself, I probably wouldn't have had the PRs. But using them together, boom, it was fantastic.
Steve, you know, sorry to jump in, but you know, and listeners, regular listeners know how much of a fan of Anavar I am. I can see me, as I said earlier on, with regards to maybe doing another cycle late in the year, absolutely running Proviron and Anavar together. 50 milligrams a day, 350 milligrams a week of Anavar. It's a sweet spot for 95% of the people listening to this show. We would encourage the females to go a lot less, of course, 2.5, 5 milligrams a day versus the men up between 30 to 50 milligrams. 50 milligrams is really sweet spot. And I can absolutely see doing my next cycle will almost certainly probably be Anavar for strength purposes as usual at that 50 milligrams and a single 25 milligram Proviron tablet. Listeners, if you know from checking out my logs, if you know from the regular shows that we put out, and I throw out some of the numbers of certain things I'm doing, if I can add fucking 10% to the numbers that I do by taking an additional single 25 milligram tablet of Proviron per day to my typical Anavar run solo kind of stack, certainly the stacks I've run in the past, perhaps not the one I'm running right now, but I can add 10% to my numbers, Steve, that'd be fucking brilliant. Old motherfucker using even more weight on the bars in the gym for just by adding that 25 milligram Proviron. That's going to be fucking amazing, Steve. I said this on another show recently. Why the fuck haven't I done it? I'm kind of getting excited about the idea of doing that, Steve. That would be fantastic. The last one, listeners, is EuroPharmacies Oxy Anadrol, 50 milligrams. Both the Anavar and the Anadrol I've seen, and for different purposes, of course, seen different numbers for different reasons. But like I said, I believe with the Anadrol, you're looking between 50 and 100 milligrams a day. In fact, arguably, Steve, it's one of the few drugs, and we said this on other shows, where for medical purposes, it's actually been run slightly higher, but of course it's treating a medical condition. If you don't have a medical condition, you don't need to run crazy amounts, and people get great results between 50 and 100 milligrams a day. One of the things I've talked about when it comes to Anadrol, and imagine again Proviron in this example, or Masteron in this example, to boost the purposes of the Anadrol. I've said on previous shows, we've heard stories of people using Anadrol as their first steroid ever and getting amazing results. Now, for some people, as a cutter, but I've seen numbers thrown out like 20 fucking pounds on an 8 to 12 week cycle. Whether they retained all that muscle post-cycle, and especially in the younger users, is arguable and debatable. But nevertheless, perhaps the reason was they just had a really, really good response. And again, this might be someone that was underweight, wasn't eating sufficiently well, wasn't training their asses off. And lo and behold, they put these few things together and they blew the fuck up. The 20 pounds is amazing. It's actually kind of horrible, really, because it can be uncomfortable, but it's an amazing result. Imagine again, you're adding another 5, 10%, 15% to you're talking about another 2 or 3 pounds of muscle. So for the listeners, they're going to get excited about those kind of numbers. Those are fucking amazing, Steve. So yeah, literally, again, the numbers that we're given for some of these cycles are what we would typically find people using. And again, if everything else is equal, the results you'll get from those numbers, from the cycles we suggested, would apply to 90% of you, 95% of you listening, with 1 or 2 that would not benefit from it, and others that get even better responses. And again, we're giving you the inside loop, so to speak, of a way to add another few percentage to your end game results. We see comments, reviews of products, reviews of approved sources, etc. And occasionally someone will come on and they've gained 12 pounds. Most of the time it's 6 to 8 pounds, Steve. That's perfectly normal on cycle. And of course, retaining that afterwards as much as possible. But when you get the 12 pounds and occasionally 20 pounds, typically it's a new user, but nevertheless, those kind of results are fantastic. Now, when you say, how would you like to add another 10%? That's when you start to get juicy. That's when you start to say, hang on, what are the guys talking about? How can I make my cycle better by adding 25 milligrams of Proviron, just by using Masteron over the weeks? It's equivalent of 25 to 50 milligrams a day. Yes. Why the fuck not? Why haven't I heard these things before? Here's a thing sometimes. And I used Steve and I as an example earlier. Okay. So I've followed the iron game from 1980 till now. I've been training 45 years. And I think, arguably, Steve, when I first become PEDs, I'd been training at that point 22 years. So what's that? 27 years now, thinking about PEDs, etc., etc. My maths might be slightly off. And you read about the theories and the stuff that goes on. Sometimes the reason why certain people rise to the top, I think of Bill Llewellyn, Chris Aceto, Milos Sarcev, etc., is that for whatever reason, they've had a handle on this stuff almost from the get-go. They kind of understood the science. They went off and looked at studies. And sometimes it was simply, as we're doing here, it was simply asking the right question and putting it together in a certain particular way. Now, something I've discussed on other shows recently is that the information that was available to them, and they were literally, Steve, sitting in medical libraries and going through these books, incredibly difficult. Occasionally, from the roundtable discussions on muscle media, they actually had taken part in some of these roundtable discussions, people whose job was specifically to go and research this stuff for the expert. This is what happens at college and universities. You get people that are your assistants. You literally have a team of research assistants, and you say, listen, I want every bit of information there is on the subject. Can you go and look for this? Can you go and look for that? And find me a study where this happened. Find me a study where that happened. And that's exactly what they used to be able to do, Steve. But it was a job of work. They literally had to take books off the fucking shelf, Steve, put them on the table and read these things, and then copy the information out, and then bring it back to the guru, bring it back to the professor, the lecturer, or whatever. That's difficult. It happens all the time in cancer studies and pharmaceutical studies, etc., etc. It doesn't happen as much as we'd like it to with PEDs, because for various moral and ethical reasons. But some of the information's out there. We have access to that information now in a way that's never been done before. Literally, analysis of studies, meta-analysis of studies. We get to see stuff come up all the time on government websites for this information put up there. There are literally, I believe I saw links to on Lad Bible the other day, I believe it was, Steve, specifically talks about 8 reference sources online, which are essentially giant libraries that you can search for these. You get the summation. You don't get necessarily the whole article, but you get the summation. That means you and I have that access. The listeners have that access. And so the more these things become accessible, the better we understand them. And some of it was always out there, but we just never knew where to look, and we weren't asking the right kind of questions. Now we're asking those questions. Some of our listeners are asking those questions. Members on the forum are asking those questions. And sometimes, like it has done with this article, Steve, it stimulates a debate. And we know that people have been using Proviron and Masteron for years, but perhaps they didn't fully understand the mechanisms. They wasn't looking to turbocharge their cycle. They wasn't thinking about the receptor affinity. But now we start to get those things. And we do occasionally see studies, sometimes in vitro, sometimes in vivo, where they are specifically looking to see this particular method of action. They also understand more the genetics, genes, that human gene thing. Steve, you might remember 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they thought it was going to take 20 years to identify all the genes in the human genome. It was done in 5 years. So we can start to see why certain parts of the genome work, why certain don't. Some of them are active, some of them are from a primitive man, and so on. Steve and I talk about a primitive analogy all the time, but we're getting to understand these things. We're getting to know what they do. And even if it's in a study to do with depression, even if it's in a study for people that are on CRT, we can still benefit from that information. If you want to expand on that, Steve.
Yeah, and look, I think a lot of this too over the years is throughout the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s. I can remember originally coming on the forums and seeing people's their various theories, and a lot of it was parroting, but a lot of it too was like, we know it works, we're not sure why it works, and
Yes.
I think
Yes.
bodybuilders of today, we get a bad misconception because most of these, guys on YouTube or Instagram are just morons, and they give us all a bad name. A lot of them are ex-criminals, or they're just
Steve,
guys
Steve,
who
I
are
mean, look,
Yeah,
let me just,
yeah.
yeah,
Can
sorry,
I
I'm
can
just
I
going to say
finish my
very quickly,
point?
Steve,
All
because
right, go ahead.
listen, if I was
Yeah.
doing a YouTube video, clickbait gets me more traction. Bullshit gets me more traction. Saying something outrageous gets me more traction. Saying something fucking useful and science-based doesn't get me as much traction. There are good doctors on YouTube versus idiots. Guess who gets the most fucking traction? Back to you,
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, but that's not really my point. My point is it's diluted. Like, all information gets diluted, but it was diluted in the 80s and 90s as well, because you had stupid meatheads who had their
Yeah,
theories, but their theories were based on parroting, but they weren't. They kind of knew something. Like in the 70s, they knew if I used Primo, I would get better results if I threw in some D-bol. So if I threw in a little bit of an estrogen with the DHT,
yeah,
something would click there. So they kind of knew about stacking strategies, but they didn't understand why it worked. They didn't understand in the 70s why using DECA by itself versus using DECA with Proviron was better. But now we know the science, at least on this podcast, we can understand the science and show you the
yeah,
science, so you
yeah.
can also understand, not just get the parroting and all this stuff. And I remember when I first came on the forums, you try to talk the science with these people, and a lot of them, they were bullies, and they would be basically, the moderators would bully you, and they would say you're wrong and all this stuff, and it's just like, wow, it's like the ideology was so ridiculous that if
Mm.
it wasn't their perspective on something, it must be wrong, and that's how it was. So if you come on our forums, that's not the way it is. Like, if you come on our forums and you have a scientific theory, you have a scientific idea, share it with us. We're not gonna be like, well, you're wrong, fuck you, we're banning you off
No,
the.
no, no.
But that's
I've
how it
even said
used to
recently,
be.
yeah, I've even
So
said
that would
recently, Steve.
what that would
Sorry, I
do
mean,
is that
yeah,
would actually, it would blunt progress when it comes to this stuff. When you have,
we
so
want
I think there
people
was
to
a
teach
big
us. We want
during
that kind of debate. Yeah,
there was a big problem with that in the 80s and 90s, because you were blunted. If you had some new theories and new ideas, you were blunted, and you were basically, it was unable. You can't progress with this stuff. So we've been able to progress the past 5-10 years more than ever because of podcasts like this that bring you the science and explain this stuff to you. So I hope this makes sense to you. So, Mobster, once you finish out the podcast, we have a few minutes left talking about EuroPharmacies.
yeah. Listen, listeners. Again, the regular listeners to this show, certainly members of the forums that are going to be listening to this show, will know I'm a huge fan of EuroPharmacies. I've tried and approved certain products from other sources, and will say hand on heart that that's the case. If I've tried it and used it and it works, I will fucking tell you. But my daily go-to is EuroPharmacies. If 90% of my cycles will be EuroPharmacies based. Why is this? Because I know their products work, because I've had great results. That's number one. Number two, you go, right, and I use these examples before. How long has a company been in business? We're talking about 20 plus years now for EuroPharmacies. I know where they're based, what country they operate from. I've talked to their customer reps all the time. In fact, it was one of their customer reps that encouraged the conversations that we've had today with this particular show and the previous two shows. Talk about Masteron and Proviron and why they benefit a cycle. We go off, we research, we see that he knows what he's talking about. We come back. That guy is an amazing fucking rep. I don't know how he does it, Steve. He's way better at it than I am in terms of being nice to customers or whatever else. Customer service on the website is tip top. The people that I engage with, the one and only time I've had a problem was fixed. When they had a major problem recently, they fixed it within 3 fucking days. When you look at EuroPharmacies products again, you go, right, so use this same example for multiple companies and multiple sources that we approve. And it goes thus. You want easy to search for batch numbers, codes. You want to be able to use scratch panels. You want to see holograms on products. You don't want, and we have seen this, and I'm thinking of a specific market where the fucking labels look like they've been printed on a child's ink kit. You know, one of those little rubber stamp things where you put the letters to it and you put it together. You know, we want to see professional looking products. We want to see clean looking products. We want products that have been tested, analyzed, sent to labs. We want, and we've had this, members of the forum take samples from different products, gone to a reseller, bought 10 different labs that we discussed regularly on the forums, sent those products off. And in his own words, I thought at least 1 or 2 of the products were going to sell, including EuroPharmacies. We looked at, you come back, and every single product was, I think, 94, 95, 96, 97%, Steve. There was nothing that was more than an allowable percentage, same as in pharmaceutical industry, Steve, big pharma. There's an allowable percentage of deviation, plus or minus. If you take an ibuprofen, is it 200 milligrams? Now, they try to get products on par, the way that they should be, but there's an allowable legal percentage. The allowable legal percentage was where every single one of the products, including EuroPharma, was. And in fact, arguably, in their own independent, sent outside to an independent lab testing, they've posted up product results where it's a couple of percent off. They can lie, but they haven't. They've literally said this product was a few milligrams under. We've had a couple of products that are a few milligrams over, and they've shown you that stuff. So the open and honest approach. One of the resellers was that they work with on a regular basis was asking for, what do you want to see from EuroPharma on our website? What information are we missing? Would you like EuroPharma to develop new products? They are probably, and I said this on another show recently, el numero uno in the 15 mil vials. I can't think of anything else, not looking at every single fucking source known to mankind, where they've gone away and produced 15 mil vials in the way that EuroPharma have. In fact, I said this a long time ago, and I've been proved right so far, Steve. I think they're going to change every single 10 mil vial in their range to a 15 mil vial. So long-term company, great quality products, great customer service, great customer reps. Use the product personally. I know Steve's used the product personally. You can come on the forums and check out product reviews. Look at people that have run logs like myself when I've used their products. Look at my log, look at other logs, see the results that those customers had, and say to yourself, that's the way we want to go. And it was that said, I'll just say this one more time. It was the rep that encouraged us to do these shows, to get us to learn what we've learned and to pass that information on to you. So you can thank him for that as well, specifically. So thank you very much for that, guy. You know who you are. Please note, we are not doctors and opinions are ours. It's our view and based on our experience and views on the topic. A podcast are for informational purposes and entertainment only. The freedom of speech and the First Amendment applies.